I'll admit it, I'm a pretty big nerd for rock history. If I wasn't making videos about Florida, there's a decent chance I'd be making videos about music history instead. So recently, that got me wondering, what are the biggest, weirdest, and most important moments in music history that happened right here in Florida? So I started digging, and the more I looked, the crazier and more interesting this got. This is a state where a laid-back beach bard found his sound in Key West, where some of the most aggressive music ever made was unleashed on the world, where rap lyrics turned into a landmark First Amendment battle, and yeah, one of these stories somehow ends up at Walt Disney World. Now, this is not a list of the best, biggest, or most popular artists to come from Florida. This is a list of 10 specific moments that happened in Florida that happened to influence or shape music history. Some of these are tragedies, some of these are triumphs, some of these are pretty weird. So let's just jump right in. Here's 10 moments that happened in Florida that happened to shape music history. Ray Charles learns music in Florida. Long before Ray Charles became the Ray Charles, he was just a kid growing up in the tiny town of Greenville, Florida. He was born in Georgia, but his family moved to Greenville when he was very young, and in 1937 he enrolled at the Florida School for the Deaf and the Blind in St. Augustine. Over the next 8 years, he learned Braille, music theory, and learned how to play piano, organ, clarinet, trumpet, and saxophone. Yeah, he was a multi-instrument virtuoso, and that formal education became the foundation for one of the most important musical careers in American history. Before the legend, before the sunglasses, before he became one of the most unmistakable voices in American music, there was a school in St. Augustine where a gifted kid was learning the tools that would change everything. Today you'll find a bronze statue of him in his tiny little hometown of Greenville, and the school where he first touched the piano is still standing in St. Augustine. Tampa gives birth to death metal. If Ray Charles gave us soulful music, Tampa went in the exact opposite direction. In the early 1980s, Tampa became known as the place that gave birth to death metal, one of metal's most extreme subgenres, known for its intense, aggressive sound, heavily distorted guitars, deep, growling vocals, and morbid lyrics. Now, if death metal is not your thing, first of all, totally understandable. This is a very niche genre that's not for everybody, and to be honest, it's not exactly my thing either, but even if you don't know the music, you've probably at least seen the aesthetic, those unreadable logos that look like a thorn bush tangled in a deer's antlers, and album covers that look like horror movie posters. But whether you love the genre or not, the influence is undeniable. Tampa helped shape one of the most extreme and globally influential subgenres in heavy music, and all of that traces back to one specific place, Morrison Recording. This Tampa recording studio became one of the most important addresses in heavy music. Some of the most iconic and influential death metal albums ever made were recorded right here. Records by Morbid Angel, Death, Obituary, Deicide, and Cannibal Corpse. If you're talking about the sound of death metal as the world came to know it, this is where it was first unleashed. And being inside Morrison really drives home how weirdly important the place is. It doesn't look like some dark temple of the sonic apocalypse. It looks like a really nice, clean, modern recording studio. Morrison has recorded all kinds of music here over the years, from country to gospel to rap, and even lots of audiobooks. But its work on death metal is what gave it an international reputation and helped make Tampa metal famous far beyond Florida. And it's not just music nerds or me saying that, even Hillsborough County recognizes Morrison with an official historical marker, crediting the studio with helping make Tampa the death metal capital of the world. Or as I like to say it, Tampa, a sunny place for dark music. Jimmy Buffett arrives in Key West. Before Jimmy Buffett became a restaurant chain and the patron saint of tropical escapism, he was just a struggling singer-songwriter bouncing around the South looking for a place that felt like home. In late 1971, he got fed up with Nashville, piled into a car with his friend country singer Jerry Jeff Walker and his girlfriend Murphy, and headed south until the road ran out. They arrived in Key West, and before long he was playing around town at places like the Chart Room and Captain Tony's. That was the beginning of the Key West chapter that would change everything. Now, Key West didn't just give Buffett a place to live, it gave him an entire worldview. The salty air, the bars, the boats, the drifters, the artists, the weirdos, the heat, and the semi-functional adults without real jobs, all that worked its way into the music. This is where that Gulf and Caribbean blend started becoming the Jimmy Buffett sound people now recognize instantly. And you can still feel that story all over town. Captain Tony's is still here, his recording studio, Shrimp Boat Sound, that's still here too, as is the very first location of his chain of Margaritaville restaurants. It's a reminder of how deeply tied he remained to the island long after he made it big. Buffett didn't just create a sound in Key West, he created a genre, a subculture, and even a dress code. Randy Rhodes dies in a plane crash near Leesburg. Now, rock and roll history is full of wild rebellion, but it's also full of profound loss. And the tragedy on this list that hits the hardest happened right in the middle of the state. If you don't know Randy Rhodes by name, you definitely know his work. He was the young guitar wizard behind Ozzy Osbourne's early solo classics, including the immortal guitar work on Crazy Train. I know you know that one. By 1982, he was only 25 years old and already one of the most important guitarists in rock. And by all accounts, he was just a really good dude. Ozzy took him in and treated him like a son. Then, on March 19, 1982, while the tour bus was stopped near Leesburg to repair the air conditioning, the bus driver, who was also a private pilot, took a small plane up for a reckless joyride over the property. On the second flight, with Randy and seamstress Rachel Youngblood on board, the pilot attempted to buzz the tour bus just to annoy Ozzy, who was sleeping inside. But the plane clipped it and crashed into a nearby house. All three on board were killed instantly. Ozzy and Sharon were woken up to a nightmare. Even decades later, the grief in the surviving band members' recollections is brutal. This isn't just a tragedy, this is one of rock's greatest unfinished stories. People don't just mourn Randy Rhodes because he died young, they mourn him because it was obvious how much more he had in him and we never got to see how high he really could have climbed. It almost feels eerie that such a loud legacy ended in such a quiet part of Florida. Tom Petty leaves Gainesville for stardom. Now, every town has that garage band that's convinced they're going to be famous. Usually, they aren't, but Gainesville actually had one. On April 1st, 1974, April Fool's Day, Tom Petty and his band Mudcrutch packed a van and drove out of Alachua County toward Los Angeles, California. They didn't have a record deal waiting for them, just a few $100s they raised at a farewell fundraiser concert at Westside Park the night before. It was just a desperate, all-in gamble. And that shot at stardom did not work. Shortly after the band moved to LA, Mudcrutch fell apart. But out of the ashes rose Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. The start of that long drive out of Gainesville to LA was the exact moment a local kid stopped being a hometown hero and started the long road toward becoming an American icon. So Gainesville isn't just where Petty was from, it's where the launch happened. Every town has garage bands, but Gainesville is the one that actually sent Tom Petty out into the world. 2 Live Crew sparks a free speech war in Florida. In 1990, South Florida became the front line of one of the biggest censorship battles in American music history. That year, a federal judge in Fort Lauderdale ruled that the 2 Live Crew album, As Nasty as They Wanna Be, was legally obscene. Broward County authorities went after stores selling it, and members of 2 Live Crew were even arrested after performing material from the album. That made it the first popular music album ever declared obscene by a U.S. court, before the ruling was later overturned on appeal. Now, this was not just some goofy, raunchy local controversy. This was a test of whether the government could treat lyrics as something dangerous enough to suppress. Now, even if hip-hop is not your thing, and even if 2 Live Crew is definitely not going to be the group you're going to put on at the family 4th of July cookout while grandma is sitting over there eating her potato salad, you do have to kind of respect the principle here. Free speech does not mean only protect the polite stuff. It means protecting expression when it gets loud, annoying, indecent, offensive, or uncomfortable. That is basically the whole point. Later, the group's Pretty Woman parody would even help produce a major Supreme Court fair use ruling. Florida didn't just host the controversy here, it helped shape legal boundaries around music, parody, and free speech. Dwayne Alman blocks the door and invents Southern rock. Now, if Gainesville launched Tom Petty, Jacksonville is the city that forged an entire genre. And unlike a lot of musical moments that sort of slowly evolved over time, the birth of Southern rock actually has a specific legendary origin moment. It happened on March 23, 1969. A group of musicians, including Dwayne Allman, Dickie Betts, and drummer Butch Trucks, were having a massive jam session at a house in Jacksonville. They locked into a groove that was this brand new heavy hybrid of blues, jazz, and country. It sounded incredible. When the jam finally ended, Dwayne Allman walked up to the front door, physically blocked it, and told everybody in the room, "Anybody in here who doesn't want to play in this band is going to have to fight their way out." No one fought him. A few days later, his brother Greg arrived in Jacksonville to join on keys and vocals, and the Allman Brothers Band was officially born. But that door-blocking moment is bigger than just one band. It was a spark that lit the whole city on fire. While the Alman brothers were defining this new genre, another group of local Jacksonville kids were watching, learning, and getting ready to take it to the masses themselves. They started rehearsing in a hot, swampy, mosquito-infested shed they called the Hell House. That band was Leonard Skinner. And when you add in other legends like 38 Special and Molly Hatchet, the legacy becomes undeniable. Jacksonville didn't just participate in Southern rock, Jacksonville invented it. And it all started with a guy refusing to let anyone leave a jam session. Jim Morrison is charged after the Miami concert. On March 1st, 1969, the Doors played at the Dinner Key Auditorium in Miami, and the night spiraled out of control into one of the most infamous scandals in rock history. Morrison showed up late, drunk, he antagonized the crowd, and was later charged with a felony and 3 misdemeanors over what allegedly happened on stage. The most notorious allegation is that he may have briefly introduced the audience to what we will very delicately call Little Jim Morrison. Morrison denied exposing himself, and the allegation has been disputed for decades, but the scandal was explosive either way. But whether or not the full legend happened exactly the way people retell it, Miami became the epicenter of a national moral panic over rock music, rebellion, and public morality. This was one of those moments when rock stopped being just music and became, to a lot of grown-ups at the time, evidence that society was coming off the rails. The Rolling Stones write Satisfaction in Clearwater. This one sounds like rock mythology, except it's real. In May 1965, the Rolling Stones were playing a show at Jack Russell Stadium in Clearwater. They only made it through 4 songs before 200 teenagers rushed the stage, essentially starting a riot. With fans throwing toilet paper and firecrackers, the police had to step in and use tear gas to clear the stadium. With his ears still ringing from the chaos, Keith Richards went back to the Fort Harrison Hotel in downtown Clearwater. And in the middle of the night, he woke up with a riff in his head, grabbed a tape recorder, and played it, muttering the phrase, "I can't get no satisfaction," and went back to sleep. Of course, that riff became Satisfaction, one of the Stones' biggest hits and one of the most iconic guitar riffs of all time. And just like that, Clearwater gets tied to one of the most famous songs in rock history. And in another weird twist, Fort Harrison Hotel is now the global headquarters of Scientology. It was not that at the time. Back then it was just a big fancy hotel. But it does give the story an extra layer of weirdness. Imagine writing the ultimate song about teenage rebellion after a riot in a building that now requires you to take a 200-question personality test while connected to an e-meter. And at number 1, it has to be this. The Beatles officially broke up at Walt Disney World. Yep, that's true, but there is a bit of nuance and a little bit more to the story here. For all practical purposes, the Beatles broke up back in 1970. The Fab Four's creative partnership was already over, but for legal purposes, the band was still an official legal entity all the way up until 1974, when the band's divorce became official and the paperwork was complete. In 1974, John Lennon was the final signature on the documents officially and legally dissolving the Beatles' partnership while he was on vacation staying at Walt Disney World's Polynesian Village Resort. So yeah, the official legal end of the most famous band in music history happened at Walt Disney World. Now the Polynesian is still there, of course, so you can actually visit the building where the Beatles officially ended. And honestly, only Florida could give a story where the breakup of the Beatles somehow lives in the same sentence as monorails, tiki torches, and Tonga toast. So that is Florida's weirdly stacked musical history resume. The state helped shape soul music, southern rock, death metal, free speech laws, one of the most famous guitar riffs ever recorded, and the official legal breakup of the Beatles. Which is not a sentence I expected to say when I started digging into this, but here we are. And if you love this kind of thing, you want to come along with me all over Florida, taking some deep dives into history, theme parks, state parks, top 10 lists, hidden gems, weird tourist attractions, please hit like and subscribe. That means the world to me. I am trying to hit 100,000 subscribers this year, and I think I'm getting there. Anyway, until the next one, please stay safe out there, please be nice to each other out there, and I'll see you around the Sunshine State.